The screams of burning dogs pierce the Montana night. Drug dealers laugh as they torch the K-9 training camp, flames consuming years of work in minutes. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't kill all the dogs. In their arrogance, they missed the 12 elite combat K-9s, veterans of Afghanistan's bloodiest battles, silently watching from the shadows. These aren't ordinary service dogs. They're war machines trained to hunt, track, and kill. Mason Hayes, former Marine K-9 commander, watches his life's work burn. His hands clench as he recalls the dealer's threat. Back off or burn. They chose violence. Now they'll face the consequences, because what the cartel doesn't know is that you can't outrun a military-trained hunting dog. And Mason's pack has just caught their scent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 2 weeks earlier, Mason Hayes stood in the morning sun, watching his dogs work the obstacle course. Shadow, a Belgian Malinois with battle scars across his muzzle, led the pack through the complex series of jumps, crawls, and climbing walls. Behind him, 11 other dogs moved with military precision. German shepherds, more Malinois, and 2 Dutch shepherds. Each one had served in combat zones. Each one carried invisible wounds. Mason touched the scar on his own neck, remembering the night in Kandahar when Shadow saved his life. The dog had sensed the ambush before anyone else, launching himself at a hidden insurgent just as the man was about to detonate his vest. That night forged a bond deeper than handler and dog. They became brothers in arms. Looking good, boy, Mason called as Shadow completed the course. The dog's ears perked up, but he maintained his position. Years of combat training didn't fade easily. These dogs weren't pets. They were soldiers, trying to find their place in a peaceful world. The K-9 rehabilitation camp had started 3 years ago, after Mason left the Marines. He'd seen too many military dogs struggling to adapt to civilian life, too many handlers unable to cope with their 4-legged partner's combat trauma. The sprawling Montana farmland offered space, isolation, and most importantly, purpose. The facility wasn't fancy. Converted barn, basic kennels, training grounds spread across 40 acres. But it gave these dogs a chance to use their skills constructively, to transition from war to peace while maintaining their dignity. Mason worked with law enforcement too, training their K-9 units, but his heart belonged to the combat veterans. "Sir," Jimmy, his young assistant, came running across the field. "Got those weird tracks again by the north fence. Dogs have been getting agitated around there all week." Mason frowned. He'd noticed the signs: disturbed earth, broken branches, his dog's unusual interest in that section of the property. Something wasn't right. Shadow was already alert, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. "Get the thermal scanner," Mason ordered. "I want to know what's out there." That's when he first spotted them, heat signatures moving through his property at night. The next day, he found the drug packages hidden in hollow trees. It wasn't just a few dealers. This was an organized operation using his isolated land as a transfer point. Mason knew he should have called the police immediately. But years of handling dogs had taught him to be thorough, to gather intelligence before acting. He set up cameras, documented movements, collected evidence. His dogs, with their enhanced senses and combat training, became his surveillance team. Within a week, he had mapped out the entire operation. The cartel was using his northern border as part of a major distribution route, moving product under the cover of darkness. They'd chosen his land because it was remote, unguarded, or so they thought. When 3 men in expensive suits arrived at his gate, Mason knew his investigation hadn't gone unnoticed. Shadow stood at his side, hackles raised as the cartel representatives made their pitch. $50,000 to look the other way, the leader said smoothly. Generous offer for a struggling veterans project. Mason looked at his dog, saw the tension in those muscles, the readiness to attack. These men carried concealed weapons. His dogs could smell the gun oil. "Not interested," he replied. "Reconsider." The man's voice hardened. "Next offer won't be so friendly." They left, but Mason knew this was just the beginning. That night he gathered his handlers and dogs, briefed them on the situation. These men had served in combat zones. They understood the stakes. The dogs sensed it too, the return of that familiar tension, the smell of approaching violence. "We document everything," Mason told his team. "Build a case the authorities can't ignore. Meanwhile, we stay alert. These dogs aren't just pets or service animals. They're our early warning system." He didn't know then that within days, his entire facility would be burning. Didn't realize that his determination to do the right thing would cost him everything he'd built. But as he patrolled the perimeter that night, Shadow moving like a ghost beside him, Mason felt the familiar weight of command settling on his shoulders. The cartel had chosen his land because they thought it was an easy target. They were about to learn that they hadn't just threatened a dog trainer. They'd declared war on a Marine and his pack of combat veterans, both human and canine. Dawn at the canine facility always started the same way. Mason walked the kennels, greeting each dog by name, checking their condition. Every animal had a story, each one marked by war. Rex, a German shepherd who'd lost his handler to an IED, still woke up whimpering some nights. Athena, a Belgian Malinois who'd survived 3 tours, carried shrapnel in her hip, but never slowed down. Then there was Ghost, the White Dutch shepherd who'd been shot twice, saving his entire unit from an ambush. "Morning, warriors," Mason murmured, his voice carrying the quiet authority that both dogs and handlers responded to. Behind him, Shadow followed as always, helping maintain order among the pack. The hierarchy here was clear. Shadow led the dogs, Mason led the humans, and together they maintained the delicate balance needed to heal broken soldiers. Today's training would focus on scent work. While some military dogs struggled to find new purpose after combat, their tracking abilities could be redirected. Mason had helped place dozens of rehabilitated K9s with search and rescue teams, law enforcement, and even wildlife conservation. Projects. Listen up, he addressed the assembled handlers, most of them veterans themselves. Today we're working with the new arrivals, 3 dogs fresh from Afghanistan, all with combat trauma. They need to learn that their skills still matter here. The newest additions were harder cases. Ranger, a Belgian Malinois, had been found in the ruins of a bombed base, refusing to leave his dead handler's side. Storm, a German shepherd, had become so aggressive after losing an eye that the military deemed him unsuitable for service. The third, a Dutch shepherd named Delta, still panicked at loud noises. "Take it slow," Mason instructed, demonstrating with Shadow. "Show them there's life after war." The morning unfolded in a series of careful exercises. Mason had designed his rehabilitation program around core military training principles, but with crucial differences. Instead of teaching the dogs to attack, they learned to locate and indicate. Rather than responding to threats, they practiced rescue scenarios. Sarah Chen, one of his best handlers and a former army medic, worked patiently with Storm. "Good boy," she praised as the one-eyed shepherd successfully located a hidden target, without showing aggression. "See? You've still got it." Mason watched his teamwork, pride mixing with concern. The facility operated on a shoestring budget, relying heavily on donations and volunteer help. These dogs deserved better. State-of-the-art medical care, upgraded facilities, more handlers. But they made do with what they had, and the results spoke for themselves. Jimmy appeared at his side, tablet in hand. "Latest security footage from the North Fence," he reported quietly. "They're getting bolder, 3 shipments last night alone." Mason studied the thermal images, noting how the cartel's men moved with increasing confidence through his property. They had no idea they were being watched, not just by cameras, but by some of the most highly trained military dogs in the world. "Keep documenting," he ordered, "and step up the night patrols. I want to know everything they're moving through here." The rest of the morning focused on rehabilitation work. Ranger, still grieving his handler, showed the first signs of bonding with Jake, a former Marine who'd lost his leg in the same region of Afghanistan. Storm managed an entire session without aggressive incidents. Even Delta held steady when a car backfired nearby. Progress, Sarah noted, joining Mason as they watched the dogs cool down. Slow, but real. They just need time, Mason replied. And purpose. But time was the one thing they might not have. As the day progressed, Mason couldn't shake the feeling of approaching danger. His instincts, honed by years in combat zones, warned him that the cartel wouldn't be patient forever. They'd made their offer, and his refusal would have consequences. That afternoon, he gathered his core team, Sarah, Jake, and a few other trusted handlers. "I need you all alert," he explained, showing them the surveillance photos. "These people are dangerous, and they're using our land. We keep documenting, keep our dogs ready, but no one confronts them directly." Shadow, sensing his tension, pressed against his leg. The dog's combat instincts were as sharp as ever, and lately Mason had noticed all the dogs showing increased alertness. They could sense something was wrong, that their peaceful sanctuary was under threat. "We've given too many second chances." "To give up now," Mason told his team. "These dogs survived war. They'll survive whatever's coming." He didn't know then how prophetic those words would prove, or how soon his rehabilitated warriors would need to remember their combat training. As the sun set over the Montana hills, Mason watched his dogs patrol the perimeter, their movements precise and purposeful. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were protectors, guardians of the peace they'd fought so hard to find. The cartel was about to learn that second chances didn't mean weakness. Sometimes they meant coming back, stronger. The night training session was Sarah's idea. "The dogs need to stay sharp in all conditions," she'd argued. Mason agreed. Combat rarely waited for daylight, so under a waxing moon they ran drills with Shadow, Ghost, and the more stable rehabilitated dogs. No one expected the training to expose an active drug operation. It started with Shadow's sudden alertness. The Belgian Malinois froze mid-exercise, nose twitching, muscles tensed. Ghost and Rex quickly mimicked his posture, all three dogs oriented toward the northern tree line. Mason recognized the change immediately. This wasn't training behavior. This was combat stance. "Hold position," he whispered to Sarah and Jake. The dogs' night vision was superior to theirs, but years of working together had taught them to trust their animals' instincts. Shadow's ears twitched, tracking something. In the darkness, then they heard it, the low rumble of trucks moving without headlights, the crunch of tires on fallen leaves. Mason's hand instinctively reached for a sidearm that wasn't there. This wasn't Afghanistan. He was supposed to be running a rehabilitation center, not a combat operation. Shadow looked to him for commands, warrior to warrior. Mason signaled, "Observe," a gesture that told the dog to watch but not engage. But fate had other plans. A sudden wind shift brought new sense to the dogs. Ghost's hackles rose first, followed by Rex's low growl. Before Mason could react, all three dogs were on full alert. Years of narcotic detection training had kicked in. They smelled drugs, and lots of them. "Easy," Mason commanded, but it was too late. A startled shout came from the darkness, followed by the distinctive sound of packages being dropped. Shadow was already moving, his combat training overriding everything else. Ghost and Rex flanked him, three veteran war dogs charging into the night. "Shadow, halt!" Mason called, but for the first time in years, his dog didn't obey. The scent of narcotics, combined with the adrenaline of night training, had triggered their combat responses. These weren't rehabilitation cases anymore. They were military assets responding to a threat. Chaos erupted in the darkness. Men shouted in Spanish, engines revved, and the sounds of pursuit filled the night. Mason, Sarah, and Jake ran toward the commotion, flashlights bouncing through the trees. What they found stopped them cold. Shadow had a man pinned to the ground, Ghost was standing guard over 2 large duffel bags, and Rex had chased a pickup truck off the property. The bags, they would soon discover, contained over $2 million worth of cocaine. "Get these fucking dogs off me!" the pinned man screamed. Mason recognized him, one of the businessmen who'd offered him money to look the other way. Now the cartel representative wasn't looking so professional, his expensive suit stained with dirt and fear sweat. "Shadow, hold," Mason commanded. The dog maintained his position, teeth inches from the man's throat. A veteran of door-kicking operations in Kandahar, Shadow knew exactly how much pressure to apply. "You have no idea what you've done," the man spat, his accent thickening with rage. "This is cartel business. You're dead. Your dogs are dead. Everything you love will burn." Mason surveyed the scene, his military training assessing threats and assets. More vehicles were approaching, the rest of the cartel's transport team, no doubt. They were outmanned and outgunned. "Sarah, call the police. Jake, get the dogs inside. Now." But Sarah's phone had no signal. The cartel's jammers were already up, cutting off communication. Headlights appeared at both ends of the access road, boxing them in. Mason counted at least 4 vehicles, which meant they were facing a dozen or more cartel members. Inside, he ordered his team. "Get the other dogs secured." Shadow finally released his prisoner on Mason's command. The man scrambled up, backing away as more cartel members emerged from the vehicles. Mason counted 8 visible weapons, not including what might be in the trucks. A new figure stepped forward, his authority evident in how the others deferred to him. Unlike the rest, he smiled. It was the coldest expression Mason had ever seen. "Mr. Hayes," the man's voice carried the cultured tones of expensive education, "I am Miguel Sanchez. You have interfered with a business arrangement worth considerably more than your little dog sanctuary." Mason kept his voice steady. "This is private property. Take your business elsewhere." Sanchez's smile widened. "Oh, but we chose this property carefully, remote, isolated, perfect for our needs. We tried to be generous, to make you a partner. Now," he gestured at the seized drug bags, "now you leave us no choice." The cartel members spread out, weapons raised. Mason felt Shadow pressing against his leg, ready to attack. One command, and the dog would go for Sanchez's throat, but that would only get them all killed. "You have until tomorrow night to clear out," Sanchez continued. "Take your dogs and go. After that, we can't guarantee anyone's safety. Accidents happen. Buildings burn. Dogs disappear." The threat hung in the air like poison gas. Mason's fists clenched as he imagined what these men would do to his dogs, to the traumatized veterans who had finally found peace here. "You're making a mistake," Mason warned. Sanchez laughed. "No, Mr. Hayes, you made the mistake. We own these routes. We own this territory. Your dogs may be trained for war, but are you prepared to fight one?" As if to emphasize the point, one of his men fired a shot into the air. The dogs erupted into a chorus of barking from the kennels. Even Shadow, trained to ignore gunfire, tensed for action. "Tomorrow night," Sanchez repeated. "After that, everything burns." They left as quickly as they had appeared, taking their seized drugs with them. Mason stood in the darkness, Shadow at his side, feeling the weight of command settling back onto his shoulders. He had thought his war days were over, that this place would be about healing rather than fighting, but as he watched the cartel's taillights disappear into the night, he knew the war had found them again. And this time, the enemy had made the mistake of threatening his dogs. Dawn found Mason making calls to every contact he had in law enforcement. Sheriff Tom Russell, a longtime supporter of the K9 program, arrived first. His own police dog, Max, had been trained at the facility. Cartels got deep pockets around. "Here," Russell warned, watching Shadow and Max perform a synchronized perimeter check. "Even if I arrest their guys, charges won't stick. Local judges are either scared or bought." "Then we need more eyes on the ground," Mason replied. He led the sheriff inside, where Sarah and Jake were coordinating with other handlers. The facility's morning routine had been replaced by combat preparation, dogs and humans alike sensing the approaching storm. A black SUV pulled up, and Mason tensed until he recognized the driver. Detective Lisa Martinez from the DEA's K9 unit stepped out, followed by her Belgian Malinois radar. Behind her came 3 more vehicles, each carrying police dogs and their handlers. "Heard you kicked the hornet's nest," Martinez said, her expression grim. "My team's been building a case against Sanchez for months, but we can't move without solid evidence." Mason gestured to his security cameras. "Got plenty of footage, but they're coming tonight. Evidence won't matter if we're dead." The facility had transformed into an operations center. Maps covered tables, showing cartel movement patterns documented by Mason's surveillance. The dogs sensed the energy shift, war dogs returning to their element. Even the rehabilitation cases stood straighter, responding to the pre-combat tension they remembered from overseas. "We've got 12 combat-trained dogs," Mason briefed the assembled team, "plus 7 police K9s. They know this land better than any cartel thug." "We use that advantage." Sarah spread out thermal imaging photos. "They've been moving product through these 3 routes, multiple vehicles, armed escorts. They'll hit us with everything they've got." "Why not evacuate?" one of the police handlers asked. "Live to fight another day." Shadow, as if understanding, growled softly. Mason placed a hand on his dog's head. "Because these dogs deserve better than running. They've fought real wars, protected real soldiers. Now it's our turn to protect them." Martinez nodded, radar alert at her side. "My team's with you, but we do this smart. Your dogs aren't just security, they're our best evidence gatherers. We film everything, document every move the cartel makes." Throughout the day, more allies arrived. Former military handlers Mason had helped, local K9 units who'd trained at the facility, even retired police dogs, still sharp enough to guard a perimeter. The pack was growing, not just in numbers, but in strength of purpose. "Position the combat dogs in teams of 2, Mason instructed. "They work better with backup. Police K9s focus on detection and alert. If Sanchez brings drugs with his assault, we'll have it on camera." By sunset, 25 dogs and 18 handlers were ready. The facility's perimeter bristled with cameras and motion sensors. Every dog had been equipped with a tactical vest, some carrying cameras of their own. Mason looked at his assembled force, human and canine warriors preparing for battle. These dogs had survived firefights in Afghanistan, tracked bomb makers through mountains, saved countless military lives. Now they would fight one more battle, not for a distant war, but for their own home. "Whatever happens tonight," he told the team, "remember, we're not just protecting a facility, we're protecting every dog's right to heal, to find peace after war. That's worth fighting for." Shadow pressed against his leg, combat ready and alert. Around them, dogs and handlers moved into position as darkness fell. The cartel was coming, but this time they would face more than just a training camp. They would face a pack. The cartel's first warning came at midnight. A single shot that shattered the facility's main floodlight. Shadow and Ghost were on patrol with Mason when it happened. Both dogs dropped into combat stance, their training identifying the rifle's location before the echo faded. "Sniper on the ridge," Mason radioed to his team. 700 yards northeast," Detective Martinez's voice crackled back. "My team sees him. They're not trying to hide anymore." More shots followed throughout the night. None meant to kill, just precise hits on equipment, cameras, and lights. The message was clear: we can reach you anywhere. The dogs remained unnaturally calm under fire, their battlefield experience showing. Even the police K9s held their positions, feeding off the combat dogs' steady energy. Dawn revealed the extent of the cartel's psychological warfare. Every camera on the north fence had been shot out. Tire tracks circled the entire property. They'd been probing defenses all night. But most disturbing were the small packages left at each corner of the facility. Dog collars, burned and bloody. "It's not just about the drugs anymore," Sarah said, examining the grisly warnings. "Sanchez wants to make this personal." Mason watched Shadow inspect one of the collars, the dog's hackles rising at the scent of blood. It already was personal. They just didn't know it yet. Throughout the morning, cartel vehicles made slow passes along the access road. Each time, the dogs tracked their movement with military precision. These weren't random patrols. The cartel was mapping their response. Patterns noting which dogs reacted and how quickly. "They're professionals," Martinez observed. "Ex-military, maybe. See how they maintain radio discipline, use proper recon techniques?" Mason nodded. Through his binoculars, he spotted tactical gear, standardized weapons. Sanchez isn't just sending thugs. He's got a private army. By noon, the pressure mounted. Local suppliers suddenly refused deliveries to the facility. The power company reported emergency maintenance that would cut electricity that night. Even the facility's banking app showed mysterious account issues. "They're isolating us," Jake reported, trying to restore their internet connection. "Cutting off every support system we have." But the cartel hadn't counted on the dogs' heightened awareness. Shadow alerted to tampering at the water main before the saboteurs could finish their work. Ghost caught 2 men trying to breach the fence behind the kennels. Each time, the dogs' combat training proved sharper than the cartel's tactics. "They're not just pets defending territory," Mason told his team during a quick briefing. "These dogs understand tactical warfare. They can read patterns, anticipate threats. Tonight we use that advantage." As evening approached, Martinez's surveillance team intercepted cartel radio chatter. Sanchez was mobilizing his full force. Over 40 men, heavily armed. They weren't coming just to scare them away anymore. This would be a purge. Shadow stood at Mason's side as he processed this intelligence, the dog's muscles coiled and ready. Around them, other dogs maintained their patrol patterns, moving like shadows through growing darkness. Their behavioral transformation was stunning. Therapy dogs and rehabilitation cases now moving with the precision of their combat days. "They think they're hunting us," Mason said softly, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "But they forget these dogs learned their trade in real war zones, against real enemies." The facility fell silent as night crept in. Each dog took their assigned position, human handlers trusting their animals' superior senses. They could run, try to save what they could, but Mason knew some things were worth fighting for. This wasn't just about drugs or territory anymore. This was about proving that even war dogs deserved their chance at peace. And if the cartel wanted to take that away, they'd learn why these dogs had earned their combat reputations in the first place. The real hunt was about to begin. In the tense hours before sunset, Mason gathered his handlers for one final training session. Not the rehabilitation exercises they usually ran, but something darker. A return to combat protocols that these dogs had learned in war. "Watch Shadow," he instructed, as the Belgian Malinois demonstrated silent approach tactics. "Notice how he uses cover, minimizes his silhouette. These aren't just attack patterns. They're survival skills." The other dogs observed with eerie focus. Ghost, the white Dutch shepherd, picked up the techniques instantly, his military training resurfacing like muscle memory. Even the police K9s adapted quickly, learning to move more like hunters than pursuers. "Most attack dogs are trained to be aggressive, obvious," Martinez noted, watching her radar mimic Shadow's stealth patterns. "But your combat veterans, they're different. They understand tactical warfare." Mason nodded, signaling Shadow to demonstrate room-clearing techniques. The dog moved with fluid grace, checking corners, maintaining angles of cover, exactly as he'd done in countless Afghan compounds. "In combat zones, loud aggression gets dogs killed," he explained. "These animals learn to be silent predators. Tonight we use those skills. Sarah worked with Rex and Storm, practicing coordinated takedowns. The rehabilitated dogs remembered their training, how to disable without killing, how to neutralize threats while minimizing their own exposure. Their movements were precise, professional, carrying none of the usual police K9 aggression. They're not just following commands anymore, Jake observed. They're thinking tactically, like soldiers. Individual training shifted to team exercises. Mason paired combat dogs with police K9s, letting the veterans teach their law enforcement counterparts. Shadow and Radar practiced tandem-building approaches. Ghost showed the newer dogs how to move effectively in darkness. The cartel expects attack dogs, Mason told his handlers. They'll be ready for aggressive charges, loud confrontations. They won't expect this level of coordination. The facility's layout became their tactical advantage. Every dog knew the terrain intimately. The blind spots, the acoustic shadows, the hidden approaches. Mason had them practice specific response scenarios, silent takedowns of armed intruders, coordinated herding of targets into prepared zones, non-lethal intimidation techniques. Remember, he instructed, we need evidence, not bodies. Let the dogs control the battlefield. Push them where we want them. As dusk approached, Mason introduced the final element. Scent training specifically focused on gunpowder, weapon oil, and the narcotic traces unique to cartel shipments. The dogs would know their targets by smell, able to track and identify threats even in total darkness. They're not just remembering their combat training, Martinez said, watching the dogs work. They're adapting it for this specific threat. I've never seen anything like it. Shadow demonstrated advanced countermeasures, how to approach armed targets from blind spots, how to disable without exposing handlers to fire. The other dogs followed his lead, their movements becoming more fluid, more tactically sophisticated with each run. In Afghanistan, these dogs learned to fight an enemy that played by different rules, Mason explained. The cartel thinks they're dealing with simple security animals. They have no idea what these dogs are capable of. The final hour of daylight was spent on silent communication, hand signals, body language, the subtle cues that would allow handlers to direct their dogs without sound. This wasn't standard police K9 training. This was battlefield coordination, adapted for their survival. As darkness fell, Mason gathered his team one last time. The dogs sat at alert. Combat veterans and police K9s united in common purpose. Their transformation was complete. No longer rehabilitation cases or security animals, but warriors preparing to defend their home. Tonight, we remind them why military dogs earn their combat status, Mason said quietly. Why these animals were trusted to guard America's most elite fighting forces. The cartel thinks they're hunting us? He looked at Shadow, saw the familiar focus in his dog's eyes. Let's show them what real hunters can do. The facility fell silent as night crept in. Each dog took their position, humans trusting their animals' superior senses and combat experience. The evening wind carried the first sense of approaching. Vehicles of weapons and men who thought they were the predators. They were about to learn a harsh lesson about underestimating their prey. Sheriff Russell's patrol car kicked up dust as it roared into the facility's yard. His expression as he stepped out told Mason everything before he spoke a word. Judge denied the warrant, Russell reported grimly. Says our evidence is circumstantial. That security footage you provided, mysteriously corrupted at the courthouse. Shadow growled softly, picking up Mason's tension. Around the facility, other dogs maintained their patrol patterns, but their movements had changed, more predatory, less ceremonial. They knew what was coming. What about state police? Martinez asked, Radar alert at her side. Russell shook his head. Got a stand-down order from the governor's office. Official response is that it's a local matter. He spat in the dust. Sanchez's money talks loud in the capital. Mason watched cartel vehicles making another slow pass along the access road. Through his binoculars, he counted 4 men with military-grade weapons, not even trying to hide them anymore. "They're getting bolder," Sarah observed. "Testing response times, watching how our dogs react." "Not just testing," Mason replied. "Tightening the noose. See how they've got vehicles stationed at every approach road? They're cutting off potential support." More bad news arrived with Jake's return from town. The local veterinary clinic had cancelled all appointments with the facility. Their regular supply shipment of dog food had been indefinitely delayed. Even the power company was reporting scheduled maintenance that would cut electricity to the area. "They're isolating us," Martinez concluded, "cutting off every resource before they move in." A shot rang out. Another sniper round taking out one of the remaining security cameras. The dogs didn't even flinch. Combat veterans, they were used to far worse, but the message was clear. The cartel could hit them at will. "I've got 6 deputies. Who'll stand with you?" Russell offered. "Good men, not bought." Mason appreciated the gesture, but the math was brutal. They were facing a small army of cartel gunmen, led by professionals with military training. Local deputies, however brave, wouldn't tip those scales. "Keep your men in reserve," Mason told him. "If this goes bad, someone needs to be left to tell the real story." Shadow pressed against his leg, combat-ready and alert. The Belgian Malinois had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, faced down suicide bombers, tracked high-value targets through mountain passes. Now he was facing perhaps his greatest challenge, defending his home. "We're not completely alone," Martinez said, checking her phone. "DEA's got a task force 2 hours out. If we can hold until morning." Another shot cracked across the yard, this one closer. A warning, letting them know the snipers could target handlers as easily as cameras. "They won't wait for morning," Mason said quietly. "Sanchez wants to make an example of us. Show what happens to anyone who defies the cartel." The sun was setting, now painting the Montana landscape in blood-red hues. Mason gathered his core team for final preparations. The dogs sensed the gravity of the moment, their posture shifting from alert to aggressive. "We've got 12 combat dogs, 7 police canines," he summarized. "Against an estimated 40 cartel gunmen. They've got us outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded." "Sounds like pretty even odds," Jake said, trying to lighten the mood. No one smiled. Mason looked at his assembled force, human and canine warriors preparing for a siege. These dogs had survived firefights, protected bases, saved countless lives. Now they would fight one more battle, not for a distant war, but for their own sanctuary. "Whatever happens tonight," he told them, "remember why we're here. Every dog deserves a chance to heal, to find peace after war. That's what we're defending. That's what makes it worth fighting for." The facility fell silent as darkness crept in. Each dog took their position, handlers trusting their animals' superior senses. In the distance, engine sounds grew closer. The cartel was coming in force. The lines were drawn. The time for warnings and intimidation was over. Now they would learn why military dogs earned their combat status and why you should never corner a wounded warrior. They came with fire first. Molotov cocktails arced through the darkness, shattering against the main building's walls. Flames spread rapidly, accelerated by hidden chemicals. The cartel had done their homework. They'd soaked the ground with accelerants during their earlier scouting missions. Shadow spotted the first attackers before the flames reached full blaze. His growl was different now, not the alert warning of a guard dog, but the deadly promise of a combat veteran. Around the facility, other dogs held their positions despite the growing inferno, their military training overriding natural instincts to flee. "East fence is breached," Martinez radioed, her voice tight. "At least 12 tangos moving in, armed." Mason watched the cartel's approach through his thermal scope. Their formation was professional, staggered teams, covering fire, coordinated movement. These weren't street thugs. These were trained killers. The kennels erupted in flames next, but the dogs weren't inside. Mason had anticipated this attack vector. His combat veterans were already deployed around the property's perimeter, using the fire's shadows as tactical cover. Even the police K9s had adapted, following the war dog's lead in staying low and invisible. "They're pushing us toward the center," Sarah observed, positioning herself behind a concrete barrier. Ghost and Rex flanked her, their white and black, coats making them nearly invisible in the smoke. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The cartel wasn't being subtle anymore. They wanted to pin down the handlers, separate them from their dogs. Standard anti-canine tactics: eliminate the commands, neutralize the threat, but these weren't standard dogs. Shadow moved like his namesake through the smoke, combat instincts in full control. Mason glimpsed him taking down a cartel gunman. Without a sound, a silent takedown learned in Afghan compounds. The man's weapon clattered away before he could squeeze off a shot. "Contact west!" Jake's voice crackled over the radio. "They're using tear gas!" More flames jumped between buildings. The heat became intense, forcing handlers to abandon prepared positions. This was the cartel's plan: use fire to herd them into killing zones, professional, methodical, deadly. Through the chaos, Mason heard Sanchez's voice. "Burn it all!" Every building, every dog. The attack pressed in from all sides now. Automatic weapons fire lit up the night. The facility's defenders were pushed back step by step, the heat becoming unbearable. But the dogs were in their element. Ghost appeared like a pale spirit through the smoke, taking down 2 cartel members who had flanked Martinez's position. Rex and Storm coordinated a pincer movement that drove 3 attackers straight into Sarah's line of fire. Even the police K9s showed their worth, using the combat dog's tactics to protect their handlers, but the fire was winning. The main building's roof collapsed in a shower of sparks. Ammunition cooking off in the inferno added to the chaos. Mason saw his life's work disappearing into flames. "Fall back!" he ordered. "Everyone to rally Point Bravo!" Shadow materialized. At his side, fur singed but eyes fierce. Around them, other handlers retreated with their dogs, maintaining discipline even as their world burned. The cartel pressed their advantage, more Molotovs flying through the night. "They're inside the perimeter," Martinez shouted. 30+ hostiles. Mason made the hardest call of his life. Initiate Protocol 0. It was a contingency they'd prepared for, a fighting retreat designed to look like a rout. Let the cartel think they'd won, that they'd broken the defenders' spirit. Let them believe the dogs were running scared. The reality was very different. As the facility blazed against the night sky, Mason led his people into the darkness. Behind them, 12 combat dogs and 7 police K9s moved like ghosts through the smoke, not fleeing but transitioning to hunting formation. Their real training was about to prove its worth. Sanchez's voice carried over the roar of flames. "Find them! Every handler, every dog, no survivors!" But as Mason watched his facility burn, he allowed himself a grim smile. The cartel thought they were the hunters, that they'd trapped their prey. They didn't understand what they'd actually done. They had just unleashed hell's own hunting pack. 3 miles from the burning facility, deep in the Montana wilderness, Mason's team regrouped at their predetermined fallback position. The flames still painted the night sky orange, a beacon of destruction visible for miles. But the dogs' attention wasn't on the fire anymore. They faced outward, combat instincts fully awakened, tracking scents on the wind. "Head count," Mason ordered quietly. Shadow pressed against his leg, fur still smelling of smoke, but otherwise unharmed. One by one, handlers reported in with their dogs. "All combat dogs accounted for," Sarah confirmed, checking Ghost and Rex for injuries. 5 of 7 police K9s made it. Zeus and Max. She didn't need to finish. They'd seen the police dogs go down protecting their handlers during the retreat. Martinez's voice was tight with controlled rage. 4 handlers with minor burns and smoke inhalation. Jake took a graze wound to the shoulder. But we're operational. The dog's behavior had changed dramatically. These weren't the rehabilitation cases or therapy animals of yesterday. The fire had burned away those gentler personas, leaving only their warrior cores. Even the surviving police K9s moved differently now, mimicking the combat dog's predatory. "Grace, they're hunting already," Jake observed, watching Shadow and Ghost work a scent pattern. "Not just alert, actually hunting." Mason nodded. The dogs had reverted to their military training, but with a crucial difference. In Afghanistan, they'd tracked targets because they were ordered to. Now they had personal motivation. The cartel had destroyed their sanctuary, killed their packmates. This was no longer about following commands. This was about revenge. "Sanchez's men are moving along the ridgeline," Martinez reported, checking her thermal scope. "Standard search pattern. They think we're running scared." "Good." Mason gathered his team closer. "Let them think that. Meanwhile, our dogs have caught something more interesting." Shadow's posture confirmed it. The Belgian Malinois had picked up traces of gunpowder, accelerant, and the distinct chemical smell of cartel drugs. More importantly, he'd identified specific human scents. The men who'd burned their home. The other dogs quickly locked onto the same trails. "They're not just tracking random smells," Sarah realized, watching the dogs work. "They're cataloging individual scents, creating a hunting list." The surviving police K9s learned quickly, their traditional training enhanced by the combat dog's example. Instead of barking or showing obvious excitement at a scent, they remained deadly quiet, following their military counterparts' lead. "Cartels got vehicles spotted along 5 access roads," Jake reported. "They're trying to box us in, force us, toward their blockades." Mason allowed himself a grim smile. "They still think they're dealing with normal dogs that will behave like typical fugitives." He turned to his team. "They have no idea what these animals are capable of. Show them." The night came alive with silent movement. Combat dogs paired with police K9s, the veterans teaching their law enforcement cousins how to hunt armed prey. Their movements were pure, predator now, no wasted energy, no unnecessary sounds, just the focused purpose of apex hunters on a scent. "They've adapted their military training," Martinez observed with quiet awe, "combined battlefield tactics with their natural hunting instincts." Shadow suddenly froze, head lifted toward the northern ridge. The other dogs immediately mimicked his posture. Through night vision, Mason spotted what they'd sensed, cartel spotters setting up observation posts, completely unaware they were being observed themselves. "Those men up there," Mason said softly, "they're the ones who threw the first Molotovs, the ones who burned our kennels." He didn't need to give orders. The dogs were already moving, combat veterans leading their police counterparts in silent flanking maneuvers. Their attack formation was instinctive, learned in war zones, perfected by experience, now turned against those who'd earned their hatred. "We hit back hard," Mason told his team. "Let them know what happens when you wound a war dog's pack." The facility's flames still illuminated the night, but no one was watching the fire anymore. In the darkness beyond those flames, 19 dogs had reverted to their most lethal training. They weren't security animals or therapy cases now. They were hunters. And the cartel was about to learn the difference between facing guard dogs and confronting actual 4-legged combat veterans with a score to settle. The first cartel spotter disappeared without a sound. One moment he was manning his observation post on the ridge, the next he was gone, pulled into shadows by silent hunters. His partner barely had time to register the empty position before. Shadow and Ghost materialized from the darkness. The dogs moved with lethal efficiency, their takedown techniques perfected in combat zones where sound meant death. 2 targets neutralized, Martinez whispered into her radio. No shots fired. The dog's transformation was complete. These weren't the same animals that had run rehabilitation courses yesterday. The fire had awakened something primal in them, or rather, something learned in war. They moved like special forces operators, using terrain and shadow, coordinating without sound. Mason watched through night vision as his dogs systematically dismantled the cartel's perimeter. Shadow led 2 police canines in flanking maneuvers that would have made his marine handlers proud. Ghost and Rex herded unsuspecting gunmen into prepared kill zones. Even the surviving police dogs had adapted, learning to hunt instead of just chase. Contact east, Sarah reported quietly. Sanchez is moving his main force up the valley. They think they're pushing us toward the blocked roads. But the cartel's carefully planned trap was already failing. Their scouts went dark one by one, taken, down by dogs they never saw coming. These weren't random attacks. The dogs were specifically targeting the men who smelled of accelerant and smoke, the ones responsible for burning their home. They're hunting by scent categories, Jake realized, watching Rex track a specific target. Identifying who did what during the attack, Mason nodded. In Afghanistan, these dogs had learned to differentiate between civilian and combatant scents, between bomb makers and ordinary people. Now they were using that training to identify and isolate specific cartel members, the ones who'd earned their special attention. The night's silence was broken by the first panicked radio calls from Sanchez's men. Where are they? I can't see. Static. Something's out here. Something. Silence. These aren't normal dogs. They're dead air. Fear began spreading through the cartel's ranks. They'd expected to hunt down frightened handlers and their pets. Instead, they found themselves being stalked by something far more lethal. Position compromised. A voice crackled in Spanish. They're not running. They're hunting us. Shadow appeared at Mason's side, his muzzle wet with evidence of another silent takedown. The dog's posture had changed completely. No longer alert and defensive, but aggressive and predatory. He'd identified Sanchez's scent among the targets, marking the cartel boss as his primary prey. The true scope of their tactical advantage became clear as the night wore on. The dogs could track in total darkness, coordinate without sound, and differentiate between targets based on smell alone. More importantly, they remembered their military training, how to disable sentries, how to separate targets from groups, how to create chaos in enemy ranks. They've lost containment, Martinez reported, watching cartel forces break formation, falling back to secondary positions. But retreat wasn't an option anymore. The dogs had the scent now, and their combat training combined with predatory instinct made them unstoppable hunters. They struck from multiple directions, using pack tactics that seemed almost supernatural to their terrified prey. Jesus Christ, a cartel radio squawked. They're picking us apart. The twist in the battle became even more pronounced as the dogs demonstrated their full capabilities. They weren't just attacking randomly, they were systematically cutting communication lines, isolating leadership, and channeling panicked gunmen into prepared ambush zones. Remember that joint operation in Kandahar? Mason asked Martinez as they watched Shadow's team corral another group of cartel gunmen. When we used dogs to herd insurgents into tactical positions, she nodded, understanding dawning. They're recreating combat tactics, using their military training to orchestrate a coordinated hunt. The cartel's professional discipline began to crack. Their neat formations dissolved into chaos as more men went dark. The dogs seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, striking without warning and vanishing before retaliation. Pull back! Sanchez's voice carried across the valley. Regroup at the vehicles, but even that order played into the dog's strategy. As cartel forces retreated, they found their vehicles disabled. Ghost's team had quietly shredded tires and fuel lines while the main force was distracted. The true nature of their opponents finally became clear to Sanchez. These weren't security. Dogs trained to bite and hold. These were combat veterans with years of battlefield experience. They didn't just attack, they planned, coordinated, and executed military-style operations. "They're not running from us," a cartel lieutenant radioed in rising panic. "They're playing with us, hunting us." Mason allowed himself a grim smile as Shadow returned to his side, already focused on the next target. The dog's muscles were tense, with controlled aggression, ready to resume the hunt. Around them, other handlers prepared to move forward with their dogs, following the combat veteran's lead. "You know what the cartel doesn't understand," Mason said quietly to his team. "In Afghanistan, these dogs learned to fight enemies who hid in shadows, who used fear as a weapon. Now Sanchez's men are learning the hard way. You don't corner something that's better at hunting than you are." The night was still young, and the dogs were just getting started. They had the scent of the men who burned their home, who killed their packmates. More importantly, they had the training, experience, and motivation to exact their revenge with military precision. The hunters were about to become the hunted, and no amount of cartel money or firepower could save them from what was coming. The real war was just beginning. Dawn painted the Montana hills in shades of grey as Shadow led the hunting pack along the cartel's retreat path. The Belgian Malinois moved with deadly purpose, following not just footprints, but the complex web of scents that told a deeper story. Gunpowder, blood, fear. "He's tracking their vehicles," Mason explained to Martinez as they followed the dogs. "Not just the obvious tire tracks. He's picking up traces of fuel, brake fluid, distinctive rubber compounds. These dogs learned to track bomb makers by the specific chemicals they handled. Now they're using that training to unravel the cartel's entire transportation network." Ghost and Rex worked parallel trails, each dog pursuing specific scent signatures. They'd identified unique markers for different cartel operations, drug processing, money movement, weapons storage. Every panicked retreat from their night. Hunting had led the dogs to another piece of the criminal enterprise. "It's not random," Sarah observed, watching the dogs work. "They're building a map of the entire operation. Each trail they follow reveals new connections." The police canines learned quickly from their combat veteran counterparts. Instead of just alerting to drug caches, they began recognizing patterns: which vehicles carried what, where shipments originated, how the cartel moved their products. Shadow suddenly froze, his posture signaling a major discovery. The trail led to an abandoned ranch house tucked into a valley fold. To casual observers, it looked derelict, but the dogs knew better. "Central distribution point," Martinez whispered, checking thermal readings. "Heat signatures from underground. Rooms. They've got a whole complex hidden beneath that old ranch." The dogs had done more than find a single hideout. They'd tracked the cartel's operations back to its source, using their combat training to piece together an intelligence puzzle that had eluded law enforcement for months. "This is why military dogs are so valuable in combat zones," Mason said quietly. "They don't just find targets, they understand infrastructure. Shadow didn't just follow their retreat, he followed their supply lines, their routines, their patterns of movement." The other dogs spread out in practice formation, establishing a perimeter while maintaining total silence. Their military training was evident in every movement. These weren't animals chasing prey, but soldiers conducting reconnaissance. "Sanchez thought burning our facility would destroy us," Mason noted, watching Shadow map entry points with predatory focus. Instead, he gave these dogs exactly what they needed: a reason to hunt and scent markers for every major player. In his operation, the sun climbed higher, but the dogs maintained their positions. They'd found more than a hideout. They'd found the heart of the cartel's network. Now they just needed to wait for their prey to return home. The hunt was about to become a siege. The ranch house was just the beginning. As teams watched the hideout, Shadow and Ghost led smaller units along branching trails, each scent path revealing another piece of Sanchez's empire. The dogs moved like Spec Ops teams, using terrain and cover, communicating through subtle signals learned in combat. 3 more properties connected to this hub, Martinez reported, marking locations on her tactical map. The dogs are showing us their whole distribution web. Mason watched Shadow work, the dog's behavior showing the same focused intensity he'd displayed tracking bomb makers in Afghanistan. Each location they discovered had its own scent signature. Drug processing sites carried chemical traces, money-counting houses held the distinct smell of ink and paper, weapons caches reeked of gun oil and explosives. They're not just finding buildings, Sarah realized, observing Ghost's methodical sweep. They're categorizing operations. These dogs learn to differentiate between types of threats in combat zones. Now they're applying that training to map out the cartel's entire infrastructure. The police K9s adapted quickly, learning to recognize the subtle indicators that their military counterparts used. What looked like an innocent warehouse to human eyes was revealed as a major distribution center by the dog's superior senses. Sanchez has half the county on his payroll, Jake reported, monitoring cartel radio traffic. Police, judges, politicians, all trying to coordinate a response to our attacks. But their corrupt network was already unraveling. The dogs had exposed not just physical locations, but patterns of movement. They could smell which vehicles carried payoffs, which buildings hosted meetings between cartel leaders and bought officials. Shadow suddenly alerted, his posture signaling high-value intelligence. The dog led them to a hidden office in the ranch, house's basement. Inside, they found detailed records, ledgers, computer drives, documents proving the full scope of Sanchez's corruption. "This is their command center," Martinez breathed, scanning the files. "Everything we need to take down not just the cartel, but their entire support structure." The dogs had done more than find evidence. They'd systematically dismantled the cartel's carefully constructed facade of legitimacy. Each location they exposed was another nail in Sanchez's coffin. "They'll be coming back," Mason said quietly, watching Shadow track fresh scents around the compound. "Once they realize what we've found, they'll throw everything they have at us." The dogs maintained their tactical positions, combat training evident in their disciplined patience. They weren't just waiting for targets now. They were preparing for war. The cartel's network lay exposed, but the real battle was just beginning. Sanchez's response was swift and massive. Surveillance showed cartel vehicles converging from 3 states, dozens of armed men preparing for war. They were done with subtle tactics. This would be a direct assault. "I count 40 vehicles," Martinez reported. "Heavy weapons, professional gunmen. They're calling in every asset they have." But the dogs were already 3 steps ahead. Shadow and the combat veterans had positioned their teams at strategic points around the compound, using their battlefield experience to establish kill zones and channels. The police K9s learned quickly, adapting their urban training to this new kind of warfare. "Look how they're setting up," Mason observed, watching Shadow coordinate with Ghost's team. "They're recreating defensive positions from their combat days. These dogs haven't forgotten anything they learned in war." The cartel's forces gathered in the valley below, an impressive show of force. But they didn't understand what they were really facing. These weren't security dogs trained to bark and bite. These were battle-hardened veterans who had fought in the world's deadliest combat zones. "Multiple approach vectors," Sarah noted, checking positions. "They'll try to overwhelm us with numbers." The dogs showed no fear as they watched the gathering storm. Their military training had taught them to face overwhelming odds, to turn superior numbers into a disadvantage. Each dog knew its role. Each position reinforced the others. "Sanchez is down there," Martinez confirmed through her scope. "He's commanding personally now. This is his last stand." Shadow's ears pricked at the cartel boss's name. The dog had his scent memorized. The man who ordered their home burned, who killed their packmates. This wasn't just about defense anymore. This was about justice. They think they're hunting us, Mason said quietly, checking his weapons. They still don't understand. These dogs were bred for war, trained for impossible odds. And now they're fighting for something personal. The sun began to set, painting the Montana sky in blood-red hues. Below, the cartel's army made final preparations. Above, 19 war dogs waited in perfect silence, ready to show why they had earned their combat reputations. The real hunt was about to begin. The cartel attacked at midnight, moving up the valley in coordinated waves. Their first assault was textbook military doctrine: suppressing fire, coordinated movements, professional tactics. But they made one crucial mistake. They expected the dogs to react like animals. Instead, they faced warriors. Shadow led the first counterattack, moving like a ghost through the darkness. His team of combat veterans struck without sound, without warning. 3 cartel gunmen went down before they realized what hit them. The dog's night vision and enhanced hearing made the darkness their ally. "Contact front!" a cartel soldier screamed in Spanish. "The dogs are—" His voice cut off as Ghost's team struck from the flank, using combat maneuvers perfected in Afghan mountains. Mason watched through night vision as his dogs demonstrated their full military training. They didn't just attack. They executed complex tactical operations. Police K9s herded targets into prepared kill zones. Combat veterans disabled vehicles and communications with surgical precision. "They're splitting up," Martinez called over the radio, trying to regroup at the secondary position. But that's exactly what the dogs had planned for. Rex and Storm's teams had already infiltrated the fallback location, turning the cartel's own tactical doctrine against them. The professional gunmen found themselves caught in a masterful trap. "Jesus Christ," a cartel lieutenant shouted. "These aren't dogs, they're fucking special forces." Shadow's team pushed forward, using the chaos to maximum advantage. The Belgian Malinois led his unit, straight towards Sanchez's command post, showing why military dogs were so feared in combat zones. They moved like a coordinated strike team, each dog covering the others, using terrain and darkness as weapons. "Fall back," Sanchez ordered, his composed demeanor cracking. "Get the heavy weapons up here." But the dogs had already neutralized the cartel's heavy weapon teams. Ghost's unit had systematically taken out their support positions, using silent takedown techniques learned in actual warfare. The police K9s learned quickly, adapting their training to this new kind of combat. "They're not just fighting," Sarah observed, watching the dogs work. "They're dismantling the cartel's entire tactical structure, just like they were trained to do with insurgent networks." The night erupted in chaos as the dogs pressed their advantage. Years of military training combined with natural hunting instincts made them unstoppable. They didn't attack randomly. They targeted command and control elements, communications, tactical coordination. "West sector compromised," a cartel radio squawked. "They're inside our lines." "How the hell are they inside our lines?" Mason allowed himself a grim smile. These dogs had learned to breach defensive positions from the world's best military trainers. Sanchez's men were good, but they were facing veterans of actual war. Shadow's team suddenly broke through, charging Sanchez's position with military precision. The cartel boss fired wildly, his professional demeanor completely shattered. He'd expected to face trained animals. Instead, he was fighting an organized military unit that happened to be four-legged. "Pull back to the vehicles," Sanchez screamed. "Full retreat." But retreat wasn't an option anymore. The dogs had systematically cut off every escape route, using their combat experience to predict and counter standard tactical responses. The cartel's seemingly overwhelming force had been broken into isolated pockets, each one being methodically eliminated. The raid wasn't just a battle, it was a demonstration of why military dogs earned their elite status. They didn't rely on brute force or aggression. They used strategy, coordination, and tactical superiority learned in real combat. The night belonged to the hunters now. Sanchez made his last stand in the burning ruins of his command center. The cartel boss had lost everything, his men scattered or taken down, his network exposed, his authority shattered. Now he faced his worst nightmare, Shadow, leading a pack of combat veterans closing in for the final hunt. "Keep those fucking dogs back," he screamed, firing bursts from his automatic weapon. But his shots went wild, missing the disciplined war dogs as they moved through smoke and flame. Mason watched through his tactical scope as Shadow coordinated the final assault. The Belgian Malinois had waited for this moment, the chance to confront the man who'd ordered their sanctuary destroyed. Around him, other dogs moved with lethal precision, cutting off every possible escape route. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Sanchez shouted, desperation replacing his usual control. "I have connections, political protection. You can't touch me." Ghost and Rex emerged from the shadows behind him, moving with the silent efficiency that had made military dogs so feared in combat zones. The police K9s secured the perimeter, having learned well from their veteran counterparts. Sanchez was completely surrounded, though he didn't realize it yet. "They're not just animals, Sanchez," Mason called out. "They're soldiers, and you killed their brothers." Shadow chose that moment to strike. The dog moved like his namesake, years of combat training evident in every motion. Before Sanchez could squeeze off another shot, Shadow had disarmed him with a precision takedown, the same technique he'd used on suicide bombers in Afghanistan. The cartel boss went down hard, his weapon clattering away. He tried to draw a hidden pistol, but Ghost was there instantly, clamping down on his arm with exactly enough force to disable without maiming. These dogs had learned control in the harshest combat zones. They knew the difference between subduing and killing. "Impossible!" Sanchez gasped, staring into Shadow's eyes. Gone was the sophisticated cartel leader. Now he was just another target, caught by superior warriors. "They're just dogs. Just animals." "No," Mason said, approaching with Martinez. "And their team. They're veterans, soldiers who fought harder battles than you could imagine, and you made the mistake of giving them something worth fighting for." The dogs maintained their tactical positions even as law enforcement moved. Their military training showed in every detail how they secured the scene, covered potential threats, maintained discipline even in victory. These weren't excited animals celebrating a catch. They were professionals completing a mission. Martinez read Sanchez his rights as Shadow stood guard. The dog's posture was pure military, alert, controlled, ready for any threat. Around them, the other dogs continued securing evidence and detaining surviving cartel members. Their efficiency would have made any special forces unit proud. "We found the files," Martinez told Sanchez. "Every payoff, every corrupt official, every part of your network. These dogs didn't just take you down, they exposed your entire operation." Sanchez finally understood the full scope of his defeat. He'd thought he was fighting against a training facility, against ordinary dogs and their handlers. Instead, he'd gone to war with veteran combat units who just happened to have 4 legs. "The thing about military dogs," Mason said quietly, watching Shadow maintain his guard position, "is that they never forget their training. You can try to burn their home, threaten their pack, even think you've won, but in the end, you're just another target to be neutralized." As dawn broke over the Montana mountains, the full extent of the night's operation became clear. The dogs had systematically dismantled not just Sanchez's armed force, but his entire criminal empire. They'd done it with military precision, minimal casualties, and the tactical excellence that had made them legends in combat zones. "Mission accomplished," Mason told Shadow as the dog finally stood down from his guard position. The Belgian Malinois pressed against his leg, still alert, but allowing himself to acknowledge their victory. Around them, other dogs maintained security with professional focus. They had lost their facility, but they had gained something more important. Proof that these dogs were far more than just rehabilitation cases. They were warriors who had found a new war worth fighting, and they had won it their way. Justice had been served, delivered by the four-legged veterans who had never forgotten what it meant to be soldiers. A week after Sanchez's fall, Mason stood at the burned remains of his facility. Shadow walked the perimeter out of habit, still alert, but carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a warrior who'd won his war. Around them, construction crews had already begun clearing debris. The FBI's asset forfeiture program came through, Martinez said, joining them with radar at her side. Sanchez's seized properties more than cover the rebuild. Plus, you'll have funding for the next decade. But it wasn't just about money. News of the dog's victory had spread through military and law enforcement channels. The facility would be rebuilt larger, better equipped, with proper recognition of its true purpose. A place where combat veterans, both human and canine, could heal while maintaining their dignity as warriors. "We've got 15 new applications," Sarah reported, checking her tablet as Ghost patrolled nearby. "Military working dogs from 3 different branches. Even some special forces units want to send their retiring dogs here. The reconstruction would take months, but the mission had already evolved. These weren't just rehabilitation cases anymore. They were proven warriors who deserved a chance to transition their skills to peaceful purpose." Mason watched Shadow survey his domain, the Belgian Malinois moving with the same tactical awareness that had won their battle. Some things didn't need to change. Some skills were worth keeping sharp. They had lost a facility but gained something more valuable, respect for what military dogs could truly do when called upon to fight one more war. 1 month after the battle, the new facility was taking shape. Modern kennels, advanced training grounds, and proper medical facilities rose from the ashes of the old camp. But some things remained unchanged, like Shadow's dawn patrol with Mason. The combat veteran dogs maintaining their tactical awareness, even in peace. "They're calling it the Warrior Dog Sanctuary now," Martinez said, watching new K9 teams arrive for training. Words spread through every military and law enforcement channel. They know what happened here. The dogs had earned more than victory. They'd won understanding. These weren't broken soldiers who needed fixing. They were warriors who deserved respect, who could adapt their combat skills to new missions without losing their essential nature. Shadow paused on his rounds, watching a fresh group of military dogs arrive. His posture remained alert, professional, but there was something new in his bearing. Pride, perhaps, or purpose. He'd shown what combat dogs could truly do when called upon to fight for something that mattered. "Ready for the next mission?" Mason asked his partner. Shadow's response was pure soldier, eyes forward, muscles tensed, ready for whatever challenge came next. Some wars were worth fighting. Some victories changed everything. The dawn patrol continued, warriors walking their new battleground, not in conflict but in hard-earned peace.